the audience want to ask what you're doing here?
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. This is my new Ethicsverse morning routine. Coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think changing our workplace is going to change our world, we got a real treat for you today. Today's episode, I got my beautiful bottle of Saratoga here, okay? Today's episode came from one of our Ethicuties. So thank you so much for this great topic. We're going to run through a couple of quick announcements. As I'm running through these announcements, please drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. We have a very unique opportunity in the ethics and compliance space. We have the opportunity to change our world by changing our workplaces, and we have the opportunity to reach out across the aisle in this highly collegial community that we're a part of to build our network. Our network is our net worth, neither are big enough. We have the opportunity to make some connections and avoid reinventing the wheel, which we get no bonus points for. So drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. I guarantee you, whatever you're dealing with, whatever you're struggling with, there's somebody on this call today who just got through it. For those of you who don't get the joke, look up Ashton Hall. Careful, though. That'll be all over your Instagram feed for the next 2 weeks. Let's jump into all the thought leadership that's going on in our space. Hit this QR code and you're going to see everything in the Ethico library, podcasts, books, things like that. So I encourage you to constantly be feeding your mind. You have a natural goal seek mechanism. You have this amazing tool that floats between your ears. You have to feed your mind with new information, new perspectives, and it will magically help you solve your problems in real time. So hit this QR code and see what's out there. And also, check out the Ethics Experts. This is the fastest growing ethics and compliance podcast in the world. Top 2% global podcast. So round of applause to the Ethico team for putting on such a phenomenal piece of content. We have 3 new episodes that have just dropped, one with Steven, one with Scott Sullivan, and one with Catherine. So constantly we're trying to push out new information. We're at this really interesting inflection point in our industry. We're in a once-in-a-lifetime fork in the road, and it's going to take us doing things a little bit differently for us to elevate our profession beyond where we've been at. So check that out. Again, keep feeding your mind, and keep feeding your mind with Radical Compliance. So this is my favorite blog. I get all of my information of what's going on there. So if you have not saved Radical Compliance to your bookmark bar, you should. If you haven't changed it to your homepage, you should. If you have not signed up for the newsletter, you absolutely should. Go to that homepage right now and check that out, sign up for that newsletter. I want to share a little bit about the Ethico ecosystem. We've poured millions of dollars into our tool. We've had hundreds of hours of conversations with people on the front lines in order to inform what direction this tool should go in. And it's amazing what happens when smart people who care are equipped with technology that works for them instead of them working for the technology. Our benchmark report just came out last week. So if you've not downloaded that yet, go to the Ethico website and check it out. We'll also drop something in the chat. But this benchmark report is a great resource for you to see where you're at and see where the next area of focus might be for you to improve your program. A lot of phenomenal movements in our numbers last year. And it's kind of a testament to this ethos that our company has and this philosophy that we have of focusing on quality. The money kind of takes care of itself when you can focus on quality and focus on providing actual value and focus on, providing points of leverage to our clients. That's what our entire goal is. And our G2 reviews speak for themselves. So if you've not been to G2, it's essentially Yelp for B2B software. Go on there and check out what people are saying about us. I don't need to say it. You can hear what folks are saying right from the horse's mouth. We have a promotion going as we're stepping into Q2. This is the Promised Land promotion. A lot of people are frustrated with their current vendor getting sold again, or promises on the roadmap never coming to fruition. The pain of moving is high. I just moved houses, and I can tell you I never want to move again. Changing case management systems doesn't have to be as difficult as a move, though. So we're offering up to a year free. There's, of course, some restrictions that apply, and up to a 15% discount of what you're paying right now. So if you'd like to get some found heads, you'd like to build some more effectiveness and engagement into your program, you want to drive more efficiency to utilize your limited resources in a more effective way, it's worth checking out at least to see what else is out there. All right, we're going to dive right in now. We're giving away 5 of my some of my favorite book. This is one of my favorite books from last year, Higher Ground with Allison Taylor. She was just on a couple of weeks ago. If you've not read this book, get active in the chat. You know what I'm saying? Get active in the chat and win yourself a book. We are giving away 5 of these babies today. The Ethico Ethicsverse world famous book giveaway is in live effect. Okay, with all that, welcome to our guest. Welcome to Matt Kelly. How's it going? I'm going to pass it over to you, buddy, and we can dive right in.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nick. And hello, everybody. We should have a great session today. So our topic today is, as Nick mentioned, this actually came to us from an Ethicsverse listener who wanted to have a discussion about the complex legal environment that you would normally face if you're a global company and you're a compliance officer trying to straddle multiple legal jurisdictions in multiple parts of the world. You might have differing legal requirements if you're doing an investigation, or how do you even just keep track of the various regulations that are coming from different countries? What do you do if they're in conflict? We have a whole lot of issues like that that we want to discuss. So we have two great speakers joining us. First is Amber Hersma from Sabre Corp, the travel software business, unless you guys have branched into other things, but Amber is Senior Compliance Manager there. And Amber, thank you very much for being on with us today.
Thank you, Matt.
And also joining us is Olga Ivanchenko, who until the start of the year had been with IBM, where she was Investigations Counsel and ran regulatory compliance for Eastern Europe. And Olga, you are joining us from Paris. So thank you very much to you too.
Thank you.
And all right, so for everybody listening, here are the big things that I want to try and tackle today. Number one, just kind of go over what are the big legal challenges that, or the legal differences you're likely to encounter. Anti-corruption, for example, the laws are pretty similar, but they're not necessarily identical. Or privacy standards, if you're investigating, which could be quite different between the United States and Europe. How do you map out what these differences actually are? What are some of the practical capabilities that you would want to have as a compliance officer to manage compliance and investigation issues at a global scale? Do you need local legal assistance? Do you need investigation protocols? Do you need other types of tools and things like that? And then third, what are some of the common mistakes that you are likely to make unless you think them through and avoid them, which is what we want to talk about here today. And as always, if you, the listeners, if you have questions you want to raise or you want us to try and explore, by all means, put them in the attendee chat and we'll try and get to them as quick as we can. And in theory, we save the last 10 minutes or so for Q&A, but in reality, if you ask a good question, we're going to ask it right away. So with that, I will just kind of start with a very broad question, laying the groundwork. When we talk about global legal challenges that compliance officers face, like what are we even talking about? Is it how you digest and understand specific legal obligations around the world? Is it how you manage investigations? Is it how you develop systems to manage all this stuff? Is it something else? Tell me how you would answer that or how you think about these issues. I'll start with Amber first and then Olga and then Nick. But Amber, what would you say?
Sure, thanks, Matt. I would say one of the biggest challenges would be how to manage investigations and how to make sure we're managing investigations the same, whether it be our department that's doing the managing or the legal department or human resources or employment litigation. Having a defined investigation strategy where you have key stakeholders agreeing to how to conduct the investigations. And then also we have about 85% of our employees are outside of the US. So it's important for us to keep the regulatory landscape up to date in the different regions where we have employees and the different regions where we have clients and customers. So having key employees in those strategic areas is important to us. And then having a monthly coordination where we can talk about the changing regulatory landscape for that region where we have. Olga, how about you?
Oh, yeah, I fully agree with you. I will define the procedural and cultural challenges when it comes to cross-border investigations. And the company investigation guidelines can, of course, navigate you in defining the scope of investigation planning and include country-specific legal requirements to be considered. But this may appear insufficient if the team does not get a certain level of awareness of the local cultural difference, does not get a good help with the translations from the local language, does not know local holidays, and of course, business customs. And the local legal and regional compliance officer are the best partners to connect at the very first stage of the investigation. Now, we're talking about the compliance program. We know that one of the elements of the compliance program is, of course, the evolution. And the program needs to be based and include the requirements of applicable local laws. It's supposed to be risk-based, and it needs to be regularly updated. Having said that, the compliance policies and processes can only be effective when they are followed and enforced by the employees. So the policy changes shall be well thought and well communicated and decoded to employees. And usually companies are very reluctant to change and introduce local policies when the local laws changing. So it's, you need to be absolutely confident and have local legal and outside counsel to support and delivering any policy changes. We know that code of conduct, majority of companies include the requirements to follow the stricter local law if it is stricter. So that is important to know before you start investigation. If this is cross-border investigation, before you plan your communication and training program in certain countries.
All right, and Nick, give me your thoughts, and even just listening to what Olga and Amber are saying, and some of the questions already coming in from the audience. It sounds to me like fundamentally a big part of this is getting everybody to hold hands and play nice, even though they're in different countries, they have different perceptions and expectations, but you need to have everybody buying into a common sense of this is why we are doing this. And that can't be easy. But Nick, what would you think?
Yeah, well, Olga kind of stole all my talking points there. Just kidding, Olga. So I think it's a tremendous challenge, right? You have these different local laws, you have different jurisdictions, and I think Olga touched on something super important, which was an understanding of those local cultures and customs. To your point, it's about affecting behavior. That is a game of influence, and that's a game of persuasion. And I think sometimes when we don't account for those local customs, or we implicitly don't engage with them in the right way by having like a crappy translation, or not accounting for, to Olga's point, local holidays, basic things that are part of the employee experience in that particular jurisdiction. I think when we pave over those things, or we don't honor those local dynamics, I think it's a lot harder to resonate with those groups, and thus it's a lot harder to get that voluntary participation and that voluntary compliance, which is what the basis of it all is. So I've seen a lot of success in leveraging local representatives, this compliance champions thing that we spent a lot of last year talking about. That can do a lot to kind of sniff out any issues that might be, that might not be adoptable or might not be resonant with that local group. But it's a lot to sort through, particularly with all these different changes. Olga again referred to, stricter local laws. It's definitely a game of whack-a-mole, and it's a lot of there's a lot of anxiety in it, because you just the what I don't know, I don't know what I don't know factor is exponentially higher in these kinds of situations.
So I see we have a couple of listeners asking about investigations, and I have a couple of questions about investigations, and I promise I want to get to them. But I want to first take things a little bit out of order, if I could, and talk more just about how do you keep track of what these regulations are, and what's the mechanism that you use. Now, so Amber, you had mentioned, I think, that you had a monthly coordination meeting with everybody. I don't know if you could tell us a bit about that, or should people be using a tool of some kind to track what the regulatory changes are, as opposed to just a Google News alert or a law firm that that might help, but it might not be comprehensive. Amber, what would you say to try and figure all that stuff out? How do you keep track of it all?
I would say listservs are your best friend, right? So sign up for everything in every location, in every discipline, so that you have every notification that you get, and then drive them to a central location. We have a compliance inbox where we drive all that traffic so that no matter who it is on our team can see that. And then we have someone that triages that information and sends it out in an alert to us. The other thing is to determine when you're in these listservs and you get the information about the regulatory changes, what are your action items? Have a plan of what do you do once you see this regulatory change? Do you need to get buy-in from other stakeholders in your business? And if so, get that on the books sooner than later, because no one likes change, right? If you moved my cheese is a big thing. So we need to have constant communication and having listservs, and then also a vendor that helps. It could be an outside counsel law firm that's helping, or it could be a sanction screening company that gives you updates once a week about, changing regulatory landscape as it comes to sanctions.
Okay. Amber, what would you recommend for the practical ways to keep track of the flood of this information?
I would think my recommendation would be having one person.
I meant to say Olga. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Out there. But Olga, what would you say to this? Well, what else are you trying to do to keep track of this information?
Well, I can only add that the information and any legal requirements that may potentially impact the life cycle of investigation needs to be known and considered in advance. And that's why it's important that regional compliance officer keeps you informed also about the novels, about the legislation that is not yet enforced. For example, companies needed to be prepared for EU whistleblower directive, right? And this is important. This is important to know in advance. So you need to proactively reach out to the regional legal and update your policies and processes regularly, because local legal are they're very busy with the commercial issues, right? And they will not proactively inform you. You cannot expect it. It's good practice, but they will not. So you need to go to them. You need to ask them proactively, for example, once in a quarter, or whatever companies decide. They need to go to all the regional and local consuls and say, look at this. Do we need to update it? Is there anything that we need to know? And of course, meetings, and of course, regular calls with regional legal colleagues. This is in addition to what already said by Amber.
I see a couple of people there asking or suggesting about specific listservs. Somebody mentioning the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and the American Corporate Counsel Association. I think they have listservs. I am on one or two from Internal Audit, which they often send out more what's going on in Canada and Mexico, things like that. I know that there are a bunch. I suspect there are more on LinkedIn. And if anybody listening knows some good listservs that you want to chime in with everybody, just pop in the name of it in the attendee chat. I think people would like to see that. Nick, I don't know if you have any other thoughts here about how to try and wrestle all of this into a workable system to absorb all this information that's floating around out there. Got to capture it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard. It's not a unique challenge. There's all these different countries and jurisdictions and all this stuff flying around. I think the model Amber talked about, I think, is smart. Having some kind of a net that sort of catches hopefully most of those things, where you can then process them and see where this might intersect with your operation. And to the extent you can do like a real-time risk assessment. I'm not saying a full-blown enterprise-wide risk assessment, but a risk assessment on a particular issue. If that's an easy process for you, or you have a tool to do that, that can often give you not only some ammunition in terms of justifying whether you do something or don't do something, it can really help you kind of prioritize your efforts on what changes you might need to account for, or which ones you can kind of deprioritize, due to materiality. I think this materiality thing is a critical element to keep in mind as well. Yeah, so we can talk more about materiality, but I think there's been some good things shared. Divya had a great question here. She said, given the vast number of laws and regulations across different countries, how do you determine which requirements are applicable to your organization's compliance program? So I think that's a really great question. I'd love to hear what the panel thinks about that. We know something popped up. How do we then weigh that out in terms of our to-do list on like where we should start to allocate resources and focus to account for it?
Yeah, Amber or Olga, I'd love to hear how you kind of, to Nick's point, figure out, yes, this is material, let's move it up the priority list, or no, this isn't? Like, how do you unpack all of that?
I would say the most stringent law, if we can move towards remediation in that, then everything kind of falls in line after that. But I do think having buy-in from your colleagues to make sure if you need shifting due to a regulation change, that you have that. Olga, what is your experience?
Yeah, I would agree that for certain concerns, for certain changes, regulatory changes, you may consult with the regional legal and compliance officer. For certain changes, you need to go to the outside counsel. But definitely, it is your legal colleague that will let you know whether these are will concern your industry, your lines of business in particular countries, because they may be different in different regions. I would say that for certain concerns such as an attorney-client privilege and data privacy, you may need to consult with outside counsel. Regarding whistleblower protections, work council agreements, labor law requirements, this is something that may be well explained by a local legal counsel. Data retention policies, etc., global policies. Anything that would require anything that is required by the local law that needs to be envisaged by the anti-corruption program of the company, or due diligence that may affect any of the company policies, compliance policies. This is something that can be consulted first with the local legal and then with outside counsel.
Here's a great comment from Kamal, I think it is. This is what we do. We send out the regulations to the impacted leaders for awareness and next steps. In addition, we use a tracker to capture the dates and if the actions were completed by the specific departments, in case specific regulations come with regulators during audits, to understand the organization's process of dissemination. I do think that's a great point, Kamal, that you would need a sort of a process to make sure that you are keeping track of the business leaders and they're doing what they are told. It implies that your system would need a certain amount of, I guess, alerting and escalation in case something has not been done yet. In fact, let me ask that question a bit. How often is it that this could be a fight to get business leaders to appreciate the urgency of doing these things? Or, what other tricks or do you have to try and get them to move in a timely manner to update their policies or change their controls or something like that? How often does that come up? I'll start with Amber and then Olga. What would you say to that?
I mean, at least quarterly it comes up, and getting buy-in is important. We do a cost-benefit analysis. When there's a regulatory change, we say, if we make the changes to fall in line, this is what it's going to cost, and this is the bonus to doing it. And then we show the other side. If we don't comply with this, and fines that we could institute or we could be subject to if we don't fall in line. And then that usually sparks the, okay, let's get moving. But
yeah, I think it's about framing it out.
To the leaders that you're trying to get buy-in from, explaining the why is very necessary. Olga, what do you think?
Yeah, well, business leaders usually very reluctant to accept any change. For one reason is because employees and their driving sales force will need to change something. They will need to comply, will need to learn, and they see it as a disruption to their business process. And you need to be absolutely confident and have local legal on your side or outside counsel to support you in delivering the policy changes if you really need to have them to the management. And you need to deliver the plan on the communication and training of the changes. And also the cost that it may involve. Also, there may be situations, and I can give you an example, when the local law is introduced, but we don't know the enforcement practice yet. It does not exist. And you may want to consider certain intermediate measures before making the final recommendations on the policy changes to the management, because you want to be absolutely sure that what you recommend will not need to be changed in 1 month or even in 6 months.
Yep. Okay. Nick, what were you going to say about framing these up?
Yeah, I just think like we have to kind of put ourselves in our adversary's shoes, our adversaries, whoever we're trying to convince. We have to put ourselves in their shoes and like understand or try to empathize with what it's going to actually take to get the action. So if the action is just them blessing your plan or it's them actually doing something, we have to make it easy. And I think sharing that why behind the what, super critical. I think a lot of executives are bombarded with like requests from people that are often not actionable or don't have that why. And it's not, it just feels like you're swatting away gnats. So I think if you can put some more gravity in that request and, employ some of the things that Amber was talking about, a cost benefit analysis, or tie it down to something that they care about, the odds of getting engagement is just so much higher. I think when we come and we delete that why because we think that they know it or they should know it or whatever, we're allowing and we're leaving it up to them too much to like do the calculus in their head and hopefully cross our fingers arrive at that conclusion. I think the more you can quote unquote dumb it down, although I hate that term, the more you can dumb it down and make it easy to like digest and anchor that down to a why, your odds of like mobilizing them is, a lot higher.
So I want to shift gears now back to what I had said originally a few minutes ago about investigations, cross-border investigations, which we could probably talk about for the rest of the week. They are that difficult. I will start by just asking, what do you see as the biggest challenges for compliance or HR or legal, who have to deal with this too, but for a compliance officer investigating something across borders, what are those biggest challenges? I'll start with Amber and then Olga, although all you listeners, if you want to pop into the chat, what drives you nuts, I'd be eager to see that too.
I would say our biggest pain point is documentation. So that's why I said it's important to have an investigations policy or standard operating procedure so that no matter who is conducting the investigation, it's conducted in the same manner. If we have documentation and somebody comes to us and says, I'm being retaliated against for a claim that I made before, if we can't go and find that documentation or be able to access the case or case management system to see what happened in that prior complaint or case, then that really cripples us in how we can move forward. And I think too, it's important to do case studies and share that information back out to the general population with the employees. Of course, keeping privacy top of mind, but maybe sharing at a high level, these are concerns that are brought to us and here's how we mitigated that. I think transparency is key where appropriate. And I think too, making sure communication between the various departments, compliance, legal, internal audit, because if we have an investigation in the compliance team and we talk to those other leaders and those other departments, and we could find a trend, right, where there's something going on in a department that might be causing that conflict. Olga, what's your experience with investigations?
Thank you, Amber. I fully agree with you. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are procedural challenges and cultural challenges. So procedural challenges are defining the scope of investigation, and securing and processing the data with consideration of the local law and considering the immediate remediation measures. For the procedure, for defining the scope of investigation, you need to ensure that you connect with your local and regional stakeholders because you may be duplicating the efforts. And here, what Amber said, it is important to know that if, for example, this potential misconduct was already reported and maybe already investigated by HR or employee relations or even legal, it is important to understand whether they follow the investigation protocol, if any, because you may need to know the findings, if there are any findings, and interview these employees. Why you need to, why it is important to define the scope of the investigation and connect with the local stakeholders, because the alleged misconduct may concern the deviation from the global processes that was already appropriately approved by the company for this particular line of business in the region. Or the misconduct concerns the deal that was lost by the company in the local tender and company never benefited from it. Or the misconduct was already concerns the terminated supplier, was already reported and reviewed. Now, with the next challenge identified is the securing and processing the data with consideration of the local law. You need to know before you start doing this. Certain employees may be leaving the companies. The investigation needs to ensure that local HR employee relations person is contacted as soon as possible, and that you know about the work council agreement in certain countries, labor laws. For example, in Germany, you cannot secure the data and process the data without the work council approval. Now, the third challenge, I think, that is the immediate remediation measures that need to be envisaged and planned in advance. For example, the alleged misconduct take place during the tender. And if it is substantiated, the company may be disbarred from the government contracting. Or the implicated employee may be promoted during the investigation life cycle. So this is to say that you need to ensure that you connect with your regional stakeholders and ensure that you can overcome all these obstacles and challenges.
All right. So, Nick, give me your thoughts here, but I want to put a bit of a spin on this, is that really Amber and Olga are both saying, make sure the local units understand what is or isn't a compliance issue. To Olga's point, maybe HR had already investigated something in some local jurisdiction there, but those HR people didn't know this is a big big compliance matter. And if you don't have visibility into that, or they don't understand where they're supposed to talk to you, it's somebody else that said in the chat there, it's important that everybody knows when they have to pivot to the compliance team, because it's that sort of a problem. So I'm just struck by a lot of this seems to be others might not know when a compliance issue has been happening, and they didn't understand that. But what do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is going to sound stupid, but it just kind of comes down to education. And I mean, if you have a business that's just in the United States, you have that challenge as, the challenge we're talking about exists in any kind of a business, like, is something in bounds? Is it out of bounds? Is it a compliance concern? Has the loop, been closed? Amber talked about, transparency to the level appropriate. And I think in general, our industry doesn't do as good of a job as we could in terms of being transparent about the outcomes of investigations and kind of how that sausage is made. And so the challenge is multiplied across, an international operation where you have different cultures, different jurisdictions, and so forth. I think over time, you start to kind of, if you're smart, you're maybe keeping a list, or you can anecdotally compile a list of some of these situations that were like in the gray, and those can be leveraged in some really smart ways. Again, using AI, or making simple videos, or putting a little, FAQ together to start compiling and kind of illustrating situations where, it should have gone one way or the other way. The opportunity and challenge in our entire ethics and compliance game is that we have the opportunity to activate all these human sensors. We have an ability to be, human beings are intelligent. We can sort of, real time run simulations in our mind to kind of come up with the right actions. So that's an opportunity to activate those human sensors. But the threat is that if those sensors are not sort of calibrated appropriately, you're going to get a lot of false positives, a lot of false negatives, or worst case scenario, a low level of engagement. So I think in these gray, and again, if you have a flywheel going, if you have a communication channel that's being utilized consistently, whether it's a monthly newsletter to all the middle managers or some kind of a compliance newsletter, like some kind of mode of communication, it creates some like existing real estate that you can utilize to really kind of put a finer point on some of these issues that maybe aren't as clear to like the layperson on the front lines.
Here's a really good point from Bill, who says, Country leadership, I presume that's some overseas jurisdiction, country leadership made clear that having an American do an accusatory interview would be culturally insensitive. We wanted to respect culture and certainly not disrespect any employee, even if there were misconduct. So we hired a local investigator fluent in local language and familiar with culture. It led to the right outcome and everybody left with their dignity intact. I think that's a very valid point. I guess my question is how often that might actually come up in the real world. How do you anticipate that and think it through? Maybe Olga, give me your thoughts on that first. You've worked in Europe for a long time. And then Amber, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too.
Well, this is very interesting point. It is important to envisage all that in the investigation plan. Take your time in cross-border investigation to consider all the cultural differences. Talk to your local stakeholders and think about what is the best way to approach employees, to schedule interviews, to handle the interviews. Will you be traveling? Will you need visas? Are those countries in a restricted list and the company you cannot travel there? Would you like your outside counsel to represent you? Would you like, or is it safe for local compliance counsel or local legal to handle those interviews or to be present during the interviews? All this needs to be considered in the investigation planning memo, and it will take some time, but you need to ensure that you respect the local holidays. You need to ensure that your interview understands you, so it's the same language. And also we expect all employees to speak English, to understand English. I had examples when I had to invite local regional compliance counsel and speak the same language and translate. And it took longer and the interview was pretty exhausting. So I think that this is important to consider this. I don't say that this is the best practice to always have someone speak in local language, because you want to be at the interview, you want to ask the questions and you don't want to interview people twice or three times and ask the same questions. But this is something that you need to consider based on all information you receive about the misconduct, about the particular employee, the compliance history of this employee, the level of involvement in the potential misconduct, and then make a decision.
Okay. Amber, what would you say to all this too?
Well, we do have local counsel in each of our big 6 locations, but I do think you raise a great point, Olga. Having someone that speaks the language is important, but it's also important that that person is comfortable. We, as the face of compliance for Sabre, we try to make sure that everyone is comfortable, the setting is comfortable, right? We do a lot of interviews and investigations over Microsoft Teams. So is the person at their home, or are they in a location? Are they somewhere where they can speak freely? Do you have an established relationship with them? If not, then it might be good to engage the local counsel. But empowering the local counsel and the local legal leaders in those areas to feel good about how they conduct investigations is very important. Again, communication is key, but I like the point of making the interviewee comfortable, because that's how you're going to get the most information that you need.
Another question that I had already, and a couple of other people have asked throughout the hour here, is how do you actually navigate when there are conflicting standards, such as there are privacy or investigation laws you have to follow in one jurisdiction that might thwart your investigation that you want to do? I've actually also heard it the other way around, where I know one example, a local audit firm of a local subsidiary was saying, this is a material thing, we're going to look into it, while the global parent was saying, this is not an issue we need to investigate. But the local auditor was somehow involved in this and went off to the races. So how do you try to navigate when either local law or local forces are, I guess, working at loggerheads. Amber, I'll start with you and then Olga, but how often does this come up and how do you try and figure that out?
I think it comes up more frequently, in the current political landscape where we have things changing frequently. And I think, it's in my best interest, I think, to make sure that we are working towards the most stringent law. And if we don't have to investigate it, if it's not something that we have to investigate, then I would do like a soft risk assessment around it. But if it's something that we have to investigate, then get the parties involved that you need. But I do agree that it can get a little dicey when you're talking about different jurisdictions. Olga, do you have any experience with this?
Yeah, I do agree with you that it doesn't really come often, but I think the good practice is the same, like, defining the scope of investigation. I mean, the first question is, what is the alleged violation, right? And is this the violation of companies' policies and processes or the violation of applicable law, local law? Then you need to look at the, whether, and ask local legal is whether this would be a violation of local law, and then what are the risks and consequences in case the allegation is substantiated, and then make a decision on based on that.
Nick, I don't know if you have any other thoughts here about how to navigate the tensions that can exist between local and parent parts of the operation, but how can a company avoid these tensions, frankly?
Yeah, I think you first just have to kind of know about them. So you can crowdsource some of that, like it's been said, by having a conversation with somebody local to get some understanding about what those local customs are, or maybe there's local rules around interviews. My man Kershwin just said in the chat, hey Kershwin, how you doing, man? He said there are certain countries where you need to document the interview in writing and need to get the person interviewed to sign off on the quote unquote transcript. So there are all these little nuances. There's all these little it's like a game of operation. Remember that old game? It's like a game of operation, and it's very difficult. And Olga kind of talked about this investigation strategy document or kind of planning brief. And I think if you can build that into your process for certain investigations that reach a certain level or that are in a different country or something like that, if that's part of the process to go through the motions of filling that thing out, it can force you to ask some questions and maybe look under some rocks you otherwise wouldn't, to avoid some of these loggerheads situations.
All right, so next question, and this is something that picked up on Olga. You had mentioned this earlier about trying to figure out, does an issue, you have an issue you're investigating, you need to figure out, does it need immediate remediation? Number one, maybe I'll put it to you first, Olga. How do you figure out whether immediate remediation is required? And then if you decide that it is, how do you break the bad news to local business units that they might need to withdraw from a deal or impose extra restrictions or fire an employee they want to keep on? But how do you navigate that if you're at the global headquarters as the compliance officer? Olga first, and then Amber, your thoughts too.
Yeah, so Chief Compliance Officer actually expects and relies on the regional compliance officer to be aware of the potential risks, because the regional compliance officer can share information about the compliance history of implicated parties or business partners, the deal size, the status of the deal, the client, the relationships with the client, the business with the client, and local limitations, legal limitations, and local legal risks. And this information helps Chief Compliance Officer to identify whether the risks are big enough and we need remediation, and discusses and whether there is enough of evidence and enough of information for the discussion with the senior management. Business usually accepts the risks and withdraws sometimes from the deal, even if the risk is well explained. It is important that also to mention that the remediation action plan is drafted at the early stages of investigation to ensure all issues are captured, recorded, and addressed, and the owners are well defined. Now, with the withdrawal, like the radical measures like withdrawal from the deal is recommended when there is evidence that the company may be inappropriately benefited if the deal is closed and there are no other ways to remediate the misconduct which already took place or will take place. For example, there is evidence that there was an inappropriate influence in one of the decision makers at the client, either by the company employee or through the third party. So if the investigation is still ongoing, you may not be able to share with the senior management what evidence you have to support this recommendation to withdraw from the deal. And management usually agrees and decides to withdraw if the compliance officer recommendations is supported by local legal. So have your local legal to support it, and in certain cases, local outside counsel. And you need to roll out the plan with the internal and external communications, remediation steps, and empower management to talk to client. And I had an example, real life example. There was an evidence that there was an appropriate influence in one of the decision makers. There was evidence that the senior manager when the senior manager proposed the remediation steps, having learned about the questionable supplier in the deal with the government client, this business manager knew the structure of the deal and the timelines, etc. And it was super important. And moreover, this manager took the ownership. So it is important to ask your manager, what do you propose to mitigate, to remediate? And sometimes they have a lot of proposals for you and which you can consider. You need to hear them. And if the deal is already closed, the compliance officer may need to ensure the remediation that will include the list of measures, roles and responsibilities of the business management. And this may include, for example, the decision not to pay the commissions to eligible employees in the deal if permitted by the local law, of course. And I had examples like this when the managers agreed not to pay commissions.
Okay. And Amber, what's your take on these the advice on how to navigate all of this and determining, yes, immediate remediation, people aren't going to like that. I have to deliver the bad news anyways. How do I win them over? What would you say to it?
To Olga's point, involving the manager or the local teams is important. And then I think too, having them being part of the remediation plan. If you have them as part of the drafting process, then they're much more likely to agree to it because they have buy-in, they have input, and they're the boots on the ground. So I think it's important getting their perspective. And then I think when there's remediation involved, that there should be a 30, 60, or 90-day follow-up afterwards to make sure that, yes, in fact, the remediation plan was put into place and that it's doing what it should. Because we've all suggested corrective action that maybe after a while we realize it could be done a different way, or there's a streamlined process to do instead. So I think reevaluating or just following up with the interested parties at an interval after the remediation plan is put in place is key.
And one thought that occurs to me, and I don't know how often this is still a issue for large global companies, but I can think of several instances in the 2010s up to the maybe 2020 or so, major misconduct cases where this happened because compliance at the headquarters wasn't even involved and didn't know these things were happening. And I think, Olga, you might have mentioned this, that the deal had already been done by the time compliance ever even heard of it. This was actually how Walmart got into trouble, if you want to go all the way back to 2011 or so. Local compliance answered into local legal and didn't really tell the central people in Arkansas that this is what we are doing. And then it festered for years and it became a big mess. So, I mean, I would just stress to everybody, make sure that the approval processes or the oversight is there so that the central headquarters can actually see and try to intercept what's going on at the local level if that has to happen. But sometimes I've seen cases where the parent company didn't even know this was happening until it had all been long gone, and now you have a much worse problem.
Yeah, that's brutal. I mean, that's like the, I don't know what I don't know effect. How do you ask those questions in a proactive way, consistently in a sustainable way to uncover these issues that locally they don't think is a big deal, that is actually a big deal at a corporate level. I mean, it's brutal. It's a hard challenge.
To that effect, I don't know if Amber and Olga, could you just talk a bit about how important it is to make sure that, your senior management is also on board with closer oversight of the local subsidiaries? How do you go about building that awareness with the senior people who you report to at headquarters to make sure that they support you when you try to exercise oversight or investigations or remediation at the local level, that you have your support ready to go? How do you, what's that like? Amber, I'll ask you first and then Olga.
Matt, I'll say engage early and often. They don't want to find out from the newspapers. They don't want to find out from operations. They want to find out from us. We can control the narrative if we give the information first. So engaging early and often, and being careful with the information that you share. Make sure you share findings when they're actual findings and they've been verified. There's a time in the investigations procedure where you bring in leadership so that they know what's happening, but it should be after you have done the investigation, or at least started it and gotten the facts, because I think I would caution folks bringing in leadership too soon in the investigation process. I think there's a tightrope that we walk of when we bring them in so that they know and they're hearing it from us, but also so that we're not having to go back and amend what we've said. Olga, what's your experience been?
I fully agree with you, Amber. So our regional compliance officer needs to be a member of the senior leadership team in the region and needs to have a seat at the table. Regional compliance officer needs to visit forecasting meetings, the budgeting meetings. By this, regional compliance officer will learn about the deals and the opportunities and the pipeline. Regular meetings with the senior leadership, not only with the senior country manager or regional manager, but also with the leadership of all business lines and business units and functions, and talk to them about what is coming. Be proactive. Try to not only be present, but try to make education about it. When you're approached with the question about compliance in the deal or in communication with the client, don't give just your advice, this is compliant or this is not compliant. Make it a little education. Use every opportunity to educate them about something with the reference to the code of conduct, the policies, the processes. They don't know it by heart. You don't know it by heart. So you use all the opportunities to do it. But my advice is to demonstrate and explain them that your goal is to protect employees and company reputation and to secure business interests as well. They need to know that you want them to do business, but to do business in integrity.
Mm-hmm. I have a friend who she's, I think she's pretty smart. She came into a program and she was trying to do what Amber just talked about, get in front of the team early and often. And she started remember back in the newspaper days, those of you who are old enough for newspapers, the police blotter in the newspaper got so much attention. Everybody always wanted to see who got arrested and that kind of stuff. So she created kind of a police blotter with compliance stories of compliance failures of other companies. And she put a little, blurb underneath of where that failure was. And that ended up getting, it gets a lot of attention. She continues to do it. It gets a lot of engagement from folks because it kind of brings that police blotter energy to the newsletter. And it gives her a little opportunity to kind of talk about the importance of it, to reiterate this message over and over and over again. You're not just going to say it once in your annual compliance training and people will be like, oh, wow, compliance is really there for us. We have to kind of have that message consistently. And that's driven a lot of engagement and a lot more sort of proactive engagement with her department. So I think I talk about this all the time. We have to be creative and we have to figure out ways to put the ball in the net. We have to figure out ways to solve the problem. And that's a smart way, I think, to kind of put some behavioral science in there and open up some of those, kind of pierce that veil of attention and get some more engagement and get some more mind share from the stakeholders whose, engagement is necessary for us to do our job.
Nick, you should know, writing up the police blotter was my first full-time job after I graduated in college at the local newspaper.
Good days, huh? Those are some good days.
Here, well, I was writing up about my neighbors plenty of times, so it was interesting. So here's a really an interesting question from one listener who is asking, do you have any advice on how to roll out a whistleblower hotline at the global level? And I'll think of something like the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive, which is somewhat standardized across Europe, but European nations could tweak it in various ways. Or I don't know if there are other obstacles in some jurisdictions that don't want to be as whistleblower or internal reporting friendly, or privacy considerations that they might have. But Amber and Olga, do you have any thoughts about, is this hard to do, to roll out the whistleblower hotline at scale? Never even put a lot aside, are they using it, but just getting it up and running. Do you encounter problems with that?
Olga, I'll let you go.
Yeah, thank you. No, there is reporting lines as soon as the employees are aware and know about the reporting lines, and they know where to report. In the companies I work for, these whistleblower programs are well established, and when EU whistleblower directive came up, I don't think there was anything that had to be dramatically changed. So these reporting lines supposed to work. They're supposed to be open. People need to know where to report. They need to know that they can report anonymously. They need to know that there will be follow-up and on their reports, and that they will not be sanctioned for reporting. There will be no retaliation. And this on this you can do a lot of communications and trainings. But this is all about speaking up and training your employees to speak up, and providing them with the communication lines, the reporting lines that are actually working, and where you ensure that you're following appropriately on the report.
All right. Amber, what would you say?
I would say, making sure that you have a way for people to report anonymously is very important, right? So we have, in the EU, we have restrictions of how much information we can keep and for how long. And making sure that there is a way for your employees to report anonymously is very important. And then a way for them to get the information back, right? So if you're using a hotline company that allows you to respond back and forth via email or encrypted, so that we don't know the identity of the reporter, but so that they know that their case or their concern is getting top priority, I think that's very important.
Okay. And so, Nick, we've only got about a minute or two here left. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that particular question, or other thoughts or closing comments.
I do. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. So I think it's never the wrong time to relaunch your line. We've had a lot of talks about this recently, and we're about to put out one of our famous toolkits in a couple of weeks. And this is going to be a full playbook that will help you. It's going to have a bunch of resources that you can leverage. You can, customize yourself. But a bunch of resources to really relaunch or launch a Speak Up line, anew or for the first time. I think your enterprise-wide disclosure tool, the thing that you utilize to crowdsource that risk intelligence across the organization and be that central risk brain to allocate these reports out to folks and direct your efforts, can be such a critical element. And the success of it is a function of the level of participation in the workforce. And I think regardless of whether you're just domestic based or you're an international organization, all human beings, I think, want their voice to be heard. People want to work for an organization that they're proud of and that they can sort of connect to. They can have some of that kind of implicit ownership. So there's so much opportunity for us to demonstrate our value, to be more impactful with our efforts when we can get that engagement. It's not easy for sure, but I think when we have to fight the desire or the tendency to fall into that status quo thinking, to say well, a hotline is just a hotline. Our case, our investigation process kind of is what it is, and that's just going to kind of do what it does. There are orders orders of magnitude more risk intelligence inside your organization. And when we can get that and in a smart way, leveraging technology, whatever, we can spend our time on the things that move the needle the most. It's so much easier to turn those light bulbs on at the top. So phenomenal. One more round of applause to our guest. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Amber. Of course, thanks to Matt Kelly, coolest guy in compliance. Next week, we got another phenomenal episode. This is why I love the freaking Ethicsverse. This is like a Substack reading the chat here. Thank you for all that participation. Next week, we're going to be talking about data analytics, data-driven compliance, overcoming analytics. I can't read. Hi. Analytics obstacles. Matt Kelly is going to be back. This is going to be one that you do not want to miss. So bring your friends, bring your neighbors, bring your enemies. We're going to keep getting better and keep growing every single day. So see you guys next week. Take care.
Thank you.